kicking things off, let me get over here. Yeah, my name is Kathryn Grayson Nanz. I'm the Developer Advocate for KendoReact Progress. But in fact, that was not really what I planned to be doing. In fact, I have a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in Studio Arts. I went to school to become a graphic designer, and I did. For many years, I worked in ad agencies doing all sorts of design work. But slowly, graphic design kind of turned into email and web design, which turned into email and web development, which turned into UI design and front-end development, and here I am. I could probably fill a whole second session just kind of talking about the experience of transitioning between those roles and why and how, but I really only bring it up today to kind of give you a little bit of context on why I'm here talking about design and how I might possibly be qualified. So these days, I really like to live in the world between design and development. I've very intentionally sought out jobs and opportunities that support me continuing to work with a foot in each of those worlds. I cannot imagine never designing again any more than I can imagine never developing again. I truly love them both so much. However, as someone who has had that experience in my career, I've also really gotten to see firsthand the way that so many developers really struggle with design. That could be in the form of difficulty collaborating with a design team, or frustration trying to work on an app or a side project of their own, or even just those kind of small design decisions. Things like choosing the right color for a button, or setting the right amount of padding, or trying to fit a new feature into an existing layout. That kind of stuff often slips through the cracks and becomes the developer's problem. No, you're good. Even when you might think of it as a design issue. And when you don't know a lot about design, all of those choices can feel really overwhelming. I can't count the number of times I've heard a developer say, I just can't make it look right, or it doesn't look professional and I don't know why. They can identify that there is something wrong there, but they cannot put their finger on what it is. And it's like trying to solve a riddle in a whole nother language. It's almost impossible. So the problem itself is one thing, but you don't even have the words to describe it. That's really what I'm hoping to kind of offer in this talk. My slides work. A kind of Rosetta Stone for the world of design. Understanding by learning enough of the fundamentals to talk about what's happening and why. But first, and again, Billy did most of this for me this morning, there's a myth that we need to debunk before we go any further. And that's this idea of having an eye for design. There's this assumption that design, or even any kind of artistic talent, is something that you are just born with. And if you don't have that natural gift, then you are just shit out of luck. That is absolutely incorrect. Design is a science, and it's based on what we know about how our eyes and our brains process the world. Once you have a grasp of those fundamentals, then you can create designs that naturally align with the way that humans interpret information. Or, as we call them, good designs. Even if you're not looking to learn everything about art and design, you're not looking to make that your career, you can and should still build up a skill set that enables you to understand what makes a design good, and then allows you to replicate that in your own work. So, that being said, you should probably start doing some of that learning, right? So, let's get into it. Welcome to Foundations of Design. Today, we will be talking through the basics of color, layout, and typography. I will be your professor for today, and I promise it will be less painful than the art history lectures that I had to sit through in college. Plus, you don't have to sit on those terrible little metal stools that they put in every art classroom for no reason, so you are already winning this. First things first is color. Color is really complex because the way we perceive and interpret a color is based pretty much entirely on the colors that are around it. So here's an example that you may or may not be able to tell based on how I've tried to calibrate the screen. At first glance, these two small squares seem to be different colors, but in truth, they are exactly the same. Depending on which background color it's paired with, our eyes are going to perceive that color differently. Having this kind of contextual awareness is really huge when it comes to our interfaces, because a color that looks one way in isolation is going to look incredibly different when it's put into a layout with lots of other colors around it. In fact, that's often what people kind of struggle with most when it comes to color, is this idea of creating color schemes, picking colors that work well together. But in order to talk about color schemes, we first need to take a step back, talk about the color wheel. Maybe not this one, which is, you probably saw the last time one of your apps crashed, but this one, the much more pleasant Johannes Eaton color wheel, which does a really good job of demonstrating the kind of relationships that you get between colors. When you combine your primary colors, which is these, red, yellow, blue, here in the center, then you get a secondary color, which you can kind of see around the second ring there. Combining a primary color with one of its secondary colors will get you a tertiary color, which you see along the outer ring. And in that way, you can make every single color by combining those three primary colors different ways. Now, when we're talking about a color's actual color, we're talking about its hue. That's kind of just the way that we name things, like green as opposed to red. But hue is really only one half of a color, because there's also value. Value is the lightness or darkness of your hue. It's what creates the difference between like a sky blue and a navy. You can change the value of a color in three ways: by adding white to create a tint, adding gray to create a tone, or adding black to create a shade. The color wheel can also kind of be split into two halves, your warm colors and your cool colors. Warm colors are your reds, oranges, yellows, things that evoke feelings of warmth and sunlight, whereas your cooler colors are blues, greens, purples, stuff that we associate with those kind of feelings of night and temperature coolness. But we extend these warm and cool feelings into their connected emotions. So warm colors can often evoke feelings of like happiness, makes you feel energized and vibrant. Whereas cool colors, on the other hand, will feel a little bit more somber. We tend to associate them with like relaxation or steadiness or knowledge. When we understand the color wheel, then we have a tool that helps us visualize the relationship that colors have with each other, and we can know in advance which colors will work together and which won't. When we're choosing colors, I recommend using one of these 4 color schemes as kind of a basis, and we'll talk through each of them to kind of figure out how they work. So first is the simplest, which is monochromatic. It uses the tints, tones, and shades of only a single hue. And it's really easy to use because you only need that one color. The downside is that you might feel a little bit of a lack of variety while you're working. This piece of painting, Mark Tanzi's Forward Retreat, is a really good example of using a monochrome color scheme to create a feeling of intensity, because repeated elements will create that kind of emphasis. We do it a lot of times, especially like verbally. When someone repeats something, they say like, no, I really, really mean it. When we underline something a bunch, or we add a bunch of exclamation points at the end of a sentence. Those are all ways in which we use repetition to indicate importance. And we can do the same thing in design. It's a tool we can use in lots of different ways, including color, to kind of tell our users, pay attention to this. This is really important. And when, of course, we are talking about monochromatic UIs, we gotta talk about Facebook, which is by far the biggest, most well-known monochromatic UI. They are blue, 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 all the way down, and we only very occasionally see them use different colors, usually only in the case of like errors or informational warnings, where we're using kind of the context awareness of the colors to quickly communicate really important information outside of the brand. A similar color scheme is analogous, which uses colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. This one is my recommendation for people that are like totally new to design and looking for a color scheme that they'll be able to use easily. Because like a monochromatic color scheme, they're very intuitive, they're hard to mess up. You kind of get all those colors aligned right next to each other on the wheel. You can kind of see them here. However, it gives you a few more colors to kind of play with than a monochromatic color scheme, so you've got some wiggle room and you've got some space to play. You kind of get the best of both worlds here. In the wild, a good example of an analogous color scheme might be BP, right? They've got their green, yellow, yellow, green, makes that perfect arc right across kind of the top of the color wheel over there. You know, works pretty well. Now we kind of start to branch across the wheel a little bit into complementary color schemes. They will use colors that are exactly opposite each other on the color wheel. Orange and blue is one that's really common, especially for some reason in movie posters. And as a UI example, we can kind of take a look at Amazon. they're really interesting because they have this orange logo, right? Super well known, lots of brand identity and connection, but orange is a really, really hard color to design with, especially in user interfaces. It feels very bright and very loud, and it's incredibly difficult to make accessible. It's hard to create enough contrast with a bright orange for it to be easily read and understood. So here they've used a really smart trick. They've taken their brand color, and they've reached across the color wheel and grabbed that blue, which is a little bit more flexible, easier to work with. And they've leaned into that as their primary UI color and have used just the orange as kind of an accent color. That allows them to keep that brand identity, leverage that kind of knowledge and association that they already have with it, and also not fight the orange the whole time. So design-wise, it's a really smart and really practical trick. If you ever find yourself struggling to design around a really difficult color, you could try reaching across the wheel. Last on our list is triadic. So this color scheme has 3 main colors, equally spaced apart from each other, that create a triangle across the color wheel. The painting here is Vermeer's Girl with the Pearl Earring. You can see uses this color scheme. She's got the red lips, the blue wrap, and then the yellow in her clothing. In a less fine art example, we can take a look at the Pepsi website, right? And kind of a similar thing here, where yellow, not one of their brand colors, right? They've got the blue and the red. But you can tell that their designer knew their color theory because every single one of their images uses this yellow as an accent color. And while the blue and red would work just fine on their website, by incorporating that yellow, they really made it pop. It really works well. This is another tip that we can steal, because a lot of times when we're thinking about designing our user interfaces, we're not really thinking about the images. In fact, when you're wireframing, there's usually just a box with an X through it, and we're like, image here. And we don't really consider that as part of the design. But it can be leveraged in really smart ways to make our design kind of go that extra mile. All right, now that we've talked about colors, let's start thinking a little bit about the actual elements on the page, which means we need to talk a little bit about brains. There is a lot that we still don't know about the human brain. But one of the things that we do know is that our brains love to categorize things. It's how we try to make sense of the absolute deluge of sensory input that we are getting all the time, every day. When we look at a design, we attempt to organize the elements on the page so that we can digest the content. And when we've designed a layout that looks good, it's often because we are working with those kind of organizational methods. When we have a design that doesn't work or doesn't feel right, it's because we're kind of creating friction with those methods. It's not leaning into the way that our brain wants to organize. When we work with them, we make our designs more intuitive. And like color, there are principles of layout that you can use to kind of align your work with how the brain organizes stuff. The most popular of these is Gestalt theory, which identifies 6 main patterns that we will use to group and make sense of information. These, like almost every design thing, makes more sense with a visual example, so let's take a look. First up is similarity, which means that we assume association between similar elements. So for example, here, we want to organize these into horizontal lines. Even though the shapes and the colors here are the same, kind of all the way up and down, the colors and the size are the same, the different shapes mean that we create these groups. We think these must be intentionally organized into rows. There must be a relationship there. Closure means that we will try to fill in any missing gaps or spaces. So here, when we look at these, we see a square and a diamond, even though there's not actually a square or a diamond present, just these weird kind of Pac-Man wedges. But our brain closes in the gaps. We've inferred the square and the diamond mentally here. Continuity means that a viewer's eye will continue along this kind of same unbroken path unless we actively interrupt it with another element. It's a little bit similar to closure, in that both have to do with how the eye moves, how we follow that invisible line. But while closure has to do with kind of the creation of the line itself, continuity has to do with how and when we interrupt it. Proximity means that we will naturally group items that are placed closely together. So in this example, we kind of group these 2 left-hand ones into a column because they're closer to each other than they are to the right-hand element. figure ground, which is not working. This is usually that optical illusion with the vase and the faces. It's extra illusiony today because you cannot see the colors. But hopefully you've seen it and you know what I'm talking about. It refers to our attempt to kind of impose our 3D understanding of the world onto 2D objects and designs. But because in the real world we are used to functioning in 3 dimensions with a sense of depth, we naturally identify things that are closer to ourselves as more immediately relevant, and like the subject or the form, kind of relegate everything else to the background. And while obviously there's no actual depth on a computer screen, we can still mimic that to bring important things forward. Finally, symmetry captures our natural sense of balance. We really want things to feel equal. When they don't, it can be kind of unsettling and off-putting. Symmetry does not always have to be perfectly exact the way this example is, but it does mean that we will seek out and feel reassured by visual balance in designs. We'll talk a little bit more about balance and how we can achieve that in a minute. But now that we have an understanding of how and why our brains attempt to organize things, we can start to combine that knowledge with visual hierarchy in order to create interfaces that capture and direct our users' attention to where we want them to be looking. Excuse me. Visual hierarchy is the practice of creating contrast in your design by combining the use of size, placement, and color to manipulate the visual weight of each element and make your most important element stand out. Size is usually the fastest and easiest way that you can create a hierarchy, because when you make one element much bigger than everything else on the page, the viewer's eye will begin there, almost regardless of anything else. So we can see an example of that here. And I feel obligated to say, please don't use word clouds. It's not actually a good design, but it does highlight this specific principle very well, right? Because when we look at this, the first thing that we see is education. It's so much bigger, and the value is so much darker than most of the other words. It jumps out to us immediately. And this is especially interesting because when our eyes break down a page, we normally kind of follow like a Z pattern. We'll start, then move across, diagonally cut down, and then go along the bottom. Kind of the order of the Z is based on which direction our language works in. So in right to left languages like Hebrew, start over here, do kind of a backwards Z. But most of the time, we'll start here, move across, scan down. Because this is so much bigger, we've disrupted that pattern, drawn the user's eye where we want them to pay attention. Another way to create this kind of hierarchy is to put your most important information at the top and then work your way down. This is kind of a newspaper model, right? So when you're looking at the newspaper, the most important stuff, right? You get the logo, and then you get that big feature story. And then as you go down the page, it gets kind of progressively less important. Your big stuff here, moving all the way down. They've combined that with size, right? So this stuff is really big. This stuff is much smaller. We're reinforcing that hierarchy by using multiple principles at once. The last piece of the visual hierarchy puzzle is color. And color is a little bit different. As we said, it depends on the colors around it. So you can see that when you're working on a lighter background, your darker colors will pop more. On a darker color, your lighter colors will pop more. It's all about achieving a big difference in value to make those things move forward in the hierarchy. But you also have to remember, not all of your users can perceive color, or not all of them will perceive it in the same way. So this is not something you can rely on quite as much as the first two. It would start by focusing on your size and your placement. Use color to kind of reinforce that hierarchy rather than be the determining factor itself. Now that we have an understanding of how to manipulate the visual weight of your elements, the next step is thinking about, oops, wrong slide. Here's a color example. You can see here the large text, opposite colors. First, the word first jumps out here. But yeah, now we're going to talk about balance. How to evenly distribute the weight of your elements across the composition. Because we as humans had to kind of master balance in order to stand upright and avoid danger and build stable structures and generally not die, we strongly associate balance with feelings of safety and of comfort. So looking at unbalanced things can make us feel kind of uneasy or tense. It's like when you see a photo that's wrong and you just want to align it on the wall. We don't want that kind of feeling, that like aggravation or tension when we're creating a user interface. An artist might want to evoke that feeling intentionally. We pretty much never do. And visual balance will work kind of the same way that physical balance does. Elements need to be equally weighted on either side of a center axis. So you can kind of imagine like a seesaw, right? Or one of those old school set of scales, the like Libra style scales. Imagine which side of your design would kind of be heavier, where more of your elements are, or where your like darker value items are. And that would change the balance of your thing. So here, if we were to imagine drawing a line right down the middle, this side would be much heavier on those scales, right? It would kind of tip it. Even though the shape and the color are the same, the size creates that feeling of heaviness, a heavier visual weight on the side of the larger square. The easiest way to create balance is through perfect symmetry, right? Mirroring two sides of a design exactly. But balance does not always have to be perfectly symmetrical. These are some examples of ones that do, where you can draw that line right down the center and see it perfectly even. But that's not always really practical, right? Sometimes we don't get elements for our user interfaces in like matched sets. So we have to improvise a little bit. And we do that with asymmetric balance, which is where we can kind of get the visual weight even without necessarily using the exact same elements on either side. Some examples of that, the most common is definitely this like text image balance that you've probably seen 1,000 times on every landing page that you've opened. This one is even Progress's landing page, right? So big picture, balanced by big text, and then almost always a button or something large that you can interact with, click with, and those weights feel balanced, even though the elements are not the same. You can also create asymmetrical balance through placement, right? So again, kind of imagining setting things on that seesaw. When you put a larger item near the center and a smaller item near the edge, that all kind of works out. One of the most common places where we see this is sidebars. They're that skinny sidebar along the side, and even though it feels like it shouldn't be balanced, it still kind of works out with the larger section there in the center. Thus far, we have focused mostly on elements that we add to the page, but the other equally important part is where we don't put anything at all. That's the white space. White space gives our eyes a place to rest and our minds a chance to process. It's how you can group or separate elements to create or break those associations that we talked about earlier. But it's really easy to get carried away when you're designing. In fact, I would say this is one of the mistakes that beginning designers make the most, because you get this blank page or you're looking at this blank artboard and you're like, all right, it's my job to fill it. Let's go. And you're throwing all kinds of stuff on the page. But you have to think about the purpose that each element on your page is serving. That's one of those places where art and design is kind of different, right? So in art, it is all about the form and how it looks, just kind of visually, if it looks visually the way that the artist wants it to. That idea of it being aesthetically pleasing is kind of top tier. Whereas in design, the function always comes first. So even if it means you might make a design that you don't think is necessarily as beautiful or as aesthetically pleasing, if it doesn't accomplish the goal, if it doesn't help the user do what they came to your page to do, then it's not a good design. A lot of times when we are struggling with issues of white space, it's because we've put things on our page that are not furthering the purpose of our design. And if we go through and kind of look at every single element and say, what is it doing? How is it helping the user do what they came to this page to do? You can almost always find something that's not doing anything at all that you can remove to increase your white space. And even here in this example, right, like there's so much information here. Our eyes don't even know where to start. It almost feels claustrophobic to kind of look at this cruise page and figure out, what am I even looking at? Where does it want me to look? What am I supposed to click? Where do you even go to book a cruise on this site? Who knows? Whereas the New York Times also has a ton of information, right? Like I can see at least 5 different major stories, a couple of different images, all the website boilerplate that you'd expect, tons of different news categories and all of that. And yet you don't feel immediately overwhelmed when you look at this. You can break this page down and figure out, okay, I wanted to see this and I can find it here. All of that has to do with the white space. So adding more to your page does not necessarily make it more performant. Finally, our last topic for today is typography. Type is incredibly powerful. We learn to read at a very young age, and from then on, we're pretty much immersed in typography for the rest of our lives. Because of this, pretty much anyone can recognize bad typography. After all, the goal is for you to be able to read it. If you can't read it, it is not a good design. The question, as always, is the opposite. What can we do to create type that looks good? Because type is kind of a world all its own, I need to start with a little bit of a history lesson. Typography, the way that we think about it today, the printing of letters by machine, not by hand, begins with the printing press and metal movable type. Really early movable type systems with like clay and wood were found in China as early as 1088, but movable type wouldn't really catch on until about 1440, when Johannes Gutenberg invented his printing press in Germany. He used a similar system, but with metal character blocks and the much more limited Germanic language characters, which is what allowed it to kind of gain popularity. This is important to know about, not just because it's a cool fact, but because it is the origin of the art of typesetting, the foundations of which are still very much in use today. In fact, most of the terms that we're going to talk about in this next section kind of go directly back to the idea of placing those movable type pieces and setting them, locking them into place. So it's helpful to kind of have it in your mind as we talk through some basics. First up is a character. A character is any single element. So that could be a letter, but also a punctuation mark or a number. Thinking back to that movable type system, it's anything that would have its own individual block of metal type. A typeface is a collection of those characters in a specific style. You already know them because you work with some of them all the time, right? Like Times New Roman or Helvetica, Calibri, whatever's default in Microsoft Word today. I don't know if it's Calibri anymore, but you use it all the time. A font, on the other hand, is a specific version of a typeface. These are those words that kind of get used interchangeably a lot, font and typeface, but they're not actually the same. So for example, Helvetica would be a typeface, but Helvetica Condensed or Helvetica Bold are specific fonts. So now you can be that guy in your office next time you want to correct somebody. But it's important to kind of think about, if you were setting something with the metal type, you want it to be bold, that's not just an effect that you would apply with your computer. You have to go back to the room with all the drawers, find the drawer of type that is Helvetica Bold 14 point, pull just that font out and set that. Kerning is the space between two characters. So sometimes you'll want to give, especially two letters, a little more or less breathing room. This usually happens when the width of the top of a character or the bottom of a character are very different. So things like A's and V's, maybe W's. When you neglect your kerning, you can kind of create gaps in words where you might not want them. So like this one is really close in, I believe, on the word savings, but they've created a strange gap in between it. That makes it difficult for people to read the word. It makes it harder for them to process what it's supposed to be. Tracking is kind of similar to kerning, another kind of set of those words that get mixed up a lot. But while kerning refers specifically to the spacing between two individual characters, tracking is a consistent amount of spacing between all your characters. And if you write CSS, you will probably know it better as letter spacing. Leading is the vertical space between your lines of text. And originally, this comes from literal lead strips that were used to separate the sentences, the lines that you were writing, setting, really, with metal type. Now, we don't use actual lead, we use pixels or points, and you probably know it as line height in CSS. It's a little thing that makes a really big difference, and it's a good way to kind of sneak in more of that white space if you're looking at your design and it's feeling a little crowded or tight. This is a strange group of words that you might not think has anything to do with typography, but in fact, these are all ways to describe various issues that can arise with how your text is laid out. So widows happen when the last line of text gets separated from the rest of its paragraph by a page break or a column wrap. Orphan is the other way around, when that first line gets separated. And then runts are those scraggly last words. Boy, that threw me. I went to go point at the screen and the screen was moving. Runts are those last little words that wrap to the bottom all by themselves. You can fix all of these by kind of dealing with your line breaks, where those hit, your spacing, your tracking, the width of your text block. All of those things can help you control for these, although some of them you just kind of have to acknowledge are a bit of a losing battle when it comes to really responsively setting type. Ooh. Finally, you might have thought, oh, I lied. Next we have rivers. This is a rough morning for me today, evidently. Rivers happen when you are unlucky enough for the breaks between certain words to line up over several lines of text. You can't see it as much in the example down here, but you can trace this one all the way up, right? And when these are larger, they can be really distracting, especially if you've got a whole page of text that you're setting, something like a blog or an article. They can be really distracting as you're trying to parse all of it. And again, something you can change by looking at your word wrapping, your line breaks, and playing with that. Finally, for real this time, you might have thought a dash is a dash is a dash, but in fact there are 3 different types of dashes and they all have different uses. The hyphen is used to separate multi-part words, things like mother-in-law or front end. Then the end dash, which is used to show ranges and numbers and dates, like June 10th to 20th. Finally, the M dash is used to separate thoughts in a sentence, like so. Those names actually, again, trace back to the metal character type, right? So an N dash will always be the same width as the lowercase letter n in your font, and an M dash will always be the same width as the M character. Now that you know some of the basic terms and the things to look out for, let's talk a little bit about choosing a typeface. There are so many categories and subcategories of typefaces based on their style, their usage, their historical context. But today we're just going to talk about 4 of the most common kind of high-level general styles and what you can best use them for. Serifs are these small decorative lines that are kind of found on characters, usually at the top and bottom, right? So it's this. These are serifs. But they are used to describe a group of typefaces that include them. Serif typefaces are traditionally associated with things like authority or expertise, trustworthiness, legacy. They have kind of an old school feeling to them. They're also really good if you're going to be setting large blocks of text, things like, a book, an article. A serif font is better because the letter forms are more easily distinguishable thanks to those defining lines. So when you're kind of skimming down the page, we can actually read the words faster because we can tell the letters apart more quickly. Working in tech, you have absolutely seen a sans serif font before. Thanks to their clean and modern look, they become really ubiquitous in this industry. They're a great choice for communicating kind of youth or friendliness or modernity or technology. Display typefaces are a little bit funky. They're kind of weird. They're distinctive, but sometimes to the detriment of their readability. They should be used, but with caution, because they can add a huge burst of personality and fun to your design. They can really help you stand apart and kind of communicate that feeling, kind of the feeling that you're hoping to evoke more easily. But they will call a huge amount of attention in your design, and they will require a pretty large font size to ensure that they're always readable. Script typefaces will mimic handwriting. And these are nice because they add a lot of humanity to your design, especially when we're talking about things that you're seeing on a screen, where that kind of humanity can feel a little bit more difficult to evoke. They're often used to communicate something as like homemade or artisan or otherwise very thoughtfully done. You don't ever want to use a script font or a display font for your body text, right? They're too difficult to read for you to set most of your type in this way. But they're really great as accents, again, to kind of help get that brand or feeling across. They're great as like subheaders, headers, small blocks of text, pull quotes, things like that where you can set just a few words or just a sentence or two in a font like this can be really helpful. All right, folks, we covered a lot today and not a lot of time. It's kind of a speed run through the fundamentals, basically my whole first year of college. But hopefully, it provided you enough insight to kind of start to get a feel for how and why design decisions are made. If you take anything away from this, I would really want you to know that design is not just random guessing. It is not putting things on the page until they feel right. There's no magic. There's nothing happening behind the curtain, except this, science-based decision making. And if that's something that is of interest to you, it is absolutely learnable. We know things, we have learned how to evoke certain responses from users using these techniques and more. And if you want to learn that, you absolutely can. Design is powerful. And when we are leveraging these tools for our applications and our websites, we can make a really positive difference in the user experience. Knowing these foundations puts you in a really strong position for both creating your own designs and collaborating with any designers that you might work with. Just make sure to only use your powers for good, never for evil. At least mostly not for evil. A little bit of evil sounds fun, but just enough to be dangerous, right? All right. Thank you guys so much.